Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong, your host. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is a place to celebrate and highlight women working within STEM and trade occupations. So please join us, tune in, take a break. We're on Smoko. And today we're extremely lucky to be joined by the lovely soon-to-be Dr. Zoë Vestrum. Zoe is a PhD student at the University of Alberta, where she is a geophysicist. Her research focuses on understanding different near surface resistivity measurements into the MT inversion model. And that's in order to reliably model deeper resistivity structures. Zoe is part of a team and group within Canada that's looking into imaging, characterizing, and modeling Canada's geothermal resources. So we're also going to talk all things geothermal. Her work is heavily field-based, so we're going to talk about her field work and what that entails. And then, as if she's not busy enough writing a PhD and doing all this work, she is also an active member of the physics department's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity. Zoe, thank you so much for coming on today. It is a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm so excited to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis, for having me. I'm very excited to be here and sharing all the work we've been doing. It's very exciting.
To start us off is like something in your background that really stood out. And I think it's really different than most people who are in geosciences is that you were so straightforward. Like you did a BSc in geophysics and then you did an MSc in geodynamics. And if I understand correctly, your dad's a geophysicist and he inspired you and influenced you to become a geophysicist as well. Could you walk through how he inspired you and how you got into this field?
Yeah, it's pretty unusual to start out in geophysics, I think, because it's not really something you hear about in high school. Even like basically you get into university and you're like, what the heck is geophysics? But it is just the study of the physics of rocks. So it's nothing too crazy. I started out in geophysics and then I just really loved it and I just never stopped. And how I got into it, I actually, when I graduated high school, I wanted to go into math. And my dad was pretty hands off. He's like, oh, you can do whatever you want. And I actually have 5 siblings and we all went different ways. And I was the only one who followed him. And yeah, it was mostly just hiking when I was a kid and looking at rocks. And I got older and I was like, wow, maybe because I went through a phase where I was like, I want to be just like my dad when I grow up.
Aw.
And then I was like in high school, I was like, oh, that's so embarrassing. And then and then I got to university and I was like, oh no, I actually do want to be just like my dad.
I
So
love
yeah.
it. I absolutely love that. Like, I love that cycle because it's so stereotypical of hitting that teenage years and being like, nah, like he's not that cool. And then as you get older to be like, yeah, exactly. I want to become exactly
Like,
like
oh,
him.
actually, he was cool the whole time. No, I'm gonna do it.
He was the OG of geophysics within our family.
Yeah.
I mean, physics of rocks are really cool. You're like, "Oh, yeah, it's not a big deal." I mean, it is a big deal. It's super interesting. It's really hard. I always remember everyone going through it that they were freaking out. What made you love it so much? And when you were learning it, did you get to go back home and talk with your dad at like the kitchen table or call him up before an exam to be like, "What the hell is this?" Did you have that kind of aspect of it when you went through your undergrad and your master's?
Yeah, I mean, me and my dad, we do study really different areas of geophysics and seismic, and I'm in electromagnetic. There's not too much overlap there. But the actual like fundamentals of rocks, because they all behave really differently, which is really honestly fascinating. I mean, if you think about the physical properties of a sandstone, it's got all this pore space and structure to it. And then you think about a granite and it's like a solid crystalline piece of rock and they behave really differently, both like electrically and physically. So seismic waves, they travel physically by vibrating the rocks. And then electromagnetics, they have electrons inside of the rocks. So you would imagine water is the main conductor of electricity in like a sandstone. But then in a granite, you actually have to move the electrons through the actual crystal. Each area of geophysics is pretty different, but they all have a lot of crossover. And then seeing it from all the different angles can get a lot of information about what's down there. And yeah, I do like literally still call my dad to talk about geophysics.
I love that. That's amazing.
Like,
Like
oh
that.
yeah, I saw this really cool talk. And he's, oh wow. And sometimes I'm like, He'll call me actually sometimes because he has a couple projects in Turkey that are geothermal. And so he'll call me and be like, "Oh yeah, no, I have this thing at work and we're working on this project. What do you think of that?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's really fascinating, Dad." And so we're just
Aw,
a couple of rock nerds.
what a blessing. That's such a wonderful thing to have a mentor in your family and to have someone going through it that you could talk to. It's really cool to hear too the differences that each rock and each structure is going to be dependent or different in terms of geophysics. I know that the one thing that your PhD is really focusing in on and like your research is focused in on MT. Could you explain what this is? And then why do you love to specialize in this? What aspect of MT that you were like, yep, this is the most interesting thing for me. I'm obsessed. I'm going to study that.
So MT is okay. So it's two words put together. So it's magneto. So we're measuring the magnetic field, and telluric, which is the electric field. And the ratio between the two is going to tell us about the resistivity structure underneath. So essentially, you go out to the field and you put down some sort of magnetometer. It's basically like a loop of wire that's like when you have a change in magnetic field, it's going to create a current in that wire. And then you're measuring the voltage across that. And then you have some electrodes that are placed 100 meters apart ish. And you're measuring the voltage across that. That'll tell you about the electric field in the ground as well. You're measuring like the naturally occurring radio waves. The sun is emitting a ton of like electromagnetic radiation, which is interacting with our magnetic field, which is creating the northern lights. And that same thing that's making the northern lights is also creating currents in the ground. So you have these changes in magnetic field, which are inducing currents in the ground. And the ratio between the two is going to tell you about how well the ground is conducting electricity.
Yeah. The movement of it,
Which is
basically,
what
right?
we're trying to understand is, okay, are these rocks conducting electricity or are they not?
Okay.
And so where the ratio comes in is if you have a large change in magnetic field and then you have a small current that is created by that large change, the ground is not conducting electricity very well. So
Yep.
you have a large source. And then if
Yes.
like, no, I don't want to
Nothing's coming
conduct
back. Yeah,
electricity.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. You're pretty resistive versus if you have a large change in magnetic field and then you have a large electric field, then you know that the ground is conducting electricity pretty well. And maybe it's like some salty water or some clays, something like that down there.
Yeah, there's so many different things that can do that, right? Then you're like open it up to like porosity, permeability, or type, right? Or
Oh yeah, there's
lithology
tons of
or
there's
structure.
tons of things it could be, which is where so my research is like specifically trying to combine different types of geophysics to get a
Cool.
better picture of what's happening because like you said, it could be there's like a long list of things that a conductor could be. Could be water, could be salty water, could be hot water, could be some melts, some clays. It could be a large number of things. And so then when you're looking at using different methods, the MT says it's conductive, so it could be anything, but then the seismic says there's no water there. So then you're like, okay, well, that narrows it down.
Yeah, that pinpoints it a little
So,
bit. You're trying to cross reference almost with your research to be like, if you take these two models and combine it or you get this data, you have a better idea of what's going on. Is that kind
yeah,
of the purpose of it?
exactly.
And I have a question there when we talked about the change in magnetic field. Is there a time based kind of
Oh,
signature
yeah.
of that?
So when we put out these stations, we let them sit for usually a day, depending on what type of survey we're doing. And then we're measuring these changes over time. And then, okay, confusingly enough, so the frequency is what's going to tell you about how deep you're looking. If you're looking at the high frequency data, it's going to tell you about maybe like the first
Couple
50 or
meters.
100 meters.
Yeah.
Because the signals have all this energy that they're losing as they go down. And then when you look at like the low frequency stuff, then, you're preserving your energy longer and you're looking deeper. So then when you're like looking at your frequency spectrum, it's telling you about essentially, it's like analogous to depth. If
Yeah,
that makes sense.
that's really,
Mhm.
really cool. Like, you're getting so much information from it
It's a lot of information.
without seeing anything either. That's probably the coolest part is that it's so different than most data collection in geosciences where you're drilling and you're excavating and you're taking up rock to try to be like, okay, what's underneath? This is all passive, almost like a passive
It is
collection
passive,
of
yeah.
data.
For seismic, you have to have a source. Sometimes they're making like explosions or have like a vibra-sized truck or something like
Mhm.
that. Versus ours, we're just measuring naturally occurring radiation, which is pretty crazy. And then it looks really deep. If you leave your station out for a week, sometimes depending on how resistive the ground is,
Mm.
you can see up to like 200 kilometers.
Wow.
So they're
That's cool.
it's
That's
pretty crazy.
fantastic.
I mean, obviously like low resolution, but
Still, it doesn't matter.
it's
I would be
still.
obsessed with that number and be like, whatever, we got to 188 kilometers.
So
Like,
yeah, they're
that's
like, "Oh, yeah, we're
mind-boggling.
looking at, like, the base of the crust." They use it to look at that, which
That's
is
so
crazy.
cool. How deep have you gone in one of your surveys?
For geothermal, we're only really wondering about the first 5 kilometers,
Okay.
and then we might drill for 1 to 2. So that's usually what I'm looking at, but
Yeah.
for that kimberlite study that we were doing in Saskatchewan, basically you're looking 'cause like, diamonds come from the
Mhm.
mantle, and so you're looking for basically where they're coming up into the lithosphere,
Mhm.
right?
That
Um,
explosion. Yeah, exactly.
so,
That, like,
yeah, you can
huge
actually kind of
punch.
trace
Yeah.
the like, kimberlites back to where they come up. So,
So
that's
cool.
pretty
Right from the
crazy.
mantle. Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. It's cool just to learn about it. I couldn't
Mhm.
imagine to see it. I've never seen a kimberlite deposit in real life. I've just heard about it. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So I would love to see that data and to be able to see the graph to be like, yep, that's exactly where it came up.
yeah.
But that's also cool to know that geothermal is so surface based.
It's so expensive to drill that a geothermal plant wouldn't be like, you could drill basically 5 kilometers anywhere and make a
Mhm.
geothermal plant because of the geothermal gradient you're increasing with depth.
Just with heat.
It's really expensive to drill, so then it's like, how much energy are you actually getting out of it?
Yeah.
Um,
What's worthwhile
so,
for
like, the
cost
cost
wise.
benefit analysis is
Mhm.
usually you don't wanna go past a couple kilometers usually.
Speaking on
Yeah.
geothermal, I guess we already did a little bit of like how they're found, but like, because you use hydrogeology and thermodynamics, could you maybe just expand a little bit on like how do you image them? How do you find them? What does it look like when you actually have found them? What are the indicators that you're like, yep, that's geothermal? And then how do you model it?
There's a few things you need for a geothermal system. It's pretty similar to like a hydrocarbon
Okay.
system where you need porosity, you need permeability, and you need fluid.
Okay.
The main thing is that when you're building a geothermal plant, you drill one hole, that's your injection well. You drill the second one, that's your extraction. And so then essentially what you're doing is you're making a little circuit where you're pushing water in, it's transporting through a rock, and then you're sucking it up on the other side of essentially a reservoir.
Very
And then
cool.
as the
Yeah.
water's transporting through it, it's collecting heat from the surrounding area. And so you need fluids, like pore space, and the ability for the fluids to flow through it in order for you to actually get this cycle going. And that's like a traditional geothermal system. Sometimes they have a closed loop one, but they haven't made that commercial yet. So there's like lots
Okay.
of emerging kind of technologies
Very
coming
cool.
out. The traditional ones are like that. And then for the system, like the kind of traditional system, which is one of the ones we're working on right now, is like essentially you have a hot spring at the surface. So you're like, okay, there's hot
There's
water
hot
here
water.
somewhere, right? And it's along a subduction zone. So you know that
Yeah.
there's like lots of heat coming to the surface. And you're essentially wondering, okay, where is this hot spring coming from? Because hot springs don't just like shoot up
No.
vertically.
No, no, no,
They
no.
kind of
They're
take a
very,
meandering path. And so
yeah.
you're wondering, okay, like
Where did you
where's
start?
this guy coming from? If we're gonna drill a kilometer down, where's the heat source? That's what we're looking at. As far as exploration in Canada at the moment, a lot of people are actually looking at the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin
Mm.
for geothermal energy, and that's pretty different than having a heat source and a hot spring. You're basically looking at going down based on the geothermal gradient,
Mm.
and then you're trying to find areas that have high
Sand
heat
beds,
flux,
basically.
which you can scan like the surface to find out. And then there's tons of well logs Alberta because of oil. One of the perks of that is that we already know a ton of information about the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basins. It might not have as much energy as a traditional system with a volcano, but you have a lot less risk. And so
Yes.
then it's easier to get investors and things like that, as opposed to just being like, oh, I'm going to try to find like the source of this hot spring. And,
Directly into a
there's no
volcano.
one's ever drilled a
Yeah.
well around here and you
Yeah.
can't even see the faults because there's like glaciation and we're just we're just
We're
going to poke
winging
a
it.
hole and hopefully
Yeah,
it'll
if I got this straight, so the traditional is usually more like a hydrogeology and like a hot spring location, volcano based. So you're actively trying to drill directly into that heat source, right? Because it's volcanic in origin, it's going to be crazy structure controlled. It's going to be hard to get to. There's just going to be a high risk of trying to find it. And you're back to geology 101 of mapping risk to be like, do we actually know where this deposit is? And then in Alberta, because of there's a high amount of oil and gas, we have a bunch of well logs, we have a bunch of information available. And then we're going to use that to look at like porosity, permeability in places that we can have like high heat flux. And that's because of the geothermal gradient. Could you explain what the geothermal gradient is to people who maybe don't know that? Because I think it's the second or third time we've mentioned it. What is that
Yeah.
gradient?
So the geothermal gradient, if you can imagine, the temperature in the ground is increasing everywhere, and the rate at which it's increasing is the geothermal gradient. And you can visualize that as being like, so in Canada, we all have basements.
Mhm.
And the reason we have basements is because the ground never freezes, because the ground is being heated actually from beneath. So if you were going to, I know a lot of people have probably never been in a mine, but one of the issues with going into a mine is that it's always hot down. I've been in a potash mine in Saskatchewan in the dead of winter, and it was like -20 outside. But then we went into the mine and it was like 35 degrees
Yeah.
with like a fan going all the time, like they were trying to cool it down. So if you can imagine that, the ground is always, the
Warmer.
deeper you go, the warmer you get, and it's pretty linear. So you could basically calculate, if I want 100 degrees and the geothermal gradient is 30 degrees per kilometer,
You just plug in the
and
math and you just
you
have
can
a
just
distance.
calculate it out.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna have to go to 3 kilometers to get, what I want.
That's
Mhm.
wonderful. It's an
So
easy way to look at it. It makes sense that you go the easy way other than going maybe for the gold of like the hottest possible
well,
volcano,
then
but
you're trying to find, like, a fracture that's, like, transporting hot water from the target is 200 meters across, and you're drilling, like, a couple kilometers, and versus in the sedimentary basin, it's all pretty, a bunch of nice flat layers, and you're like,
yeah,
"Okay, I just gotta go 3 kilometers down,
just
and I'm
hit
gonna
it.
hit this nice porous layer, and then there's gonna
Mhm.
be warm water," and it's all very calculatable.
Straightforward. It's something that probably you wouldn't expect. It's something that I didn't expect that where geothermal was pushing in Alberta was really like
Yeah.
within the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. I know a lot of Canadians and a lot of people in general are really excited about geothermal just because it's a renewable energy, it's a new source of green energy potentially. Where do you think the future of geothermal in Canada is headed? And what's something that makes you excited about this sector, about the future of geothermal energy?
Geothermal in Canada it's not new. It sounds new, but we did try to get geothermal going in the energy crisis in the 70s and 80s, but it never really picked up. And I think now that we're trying to diversify our energy portfolio, I think it's a really strong contender for assisting oil and gas in producing electricity throughout Canada, especially in Western Canada. A lot of places in Canada, which I'm really excited for the prospect of geothermal, is in the north, where they do have a lot of issues with their energy security. And then having geothermal, they may not have high enough temperatures to produce electricity, but to just heat their homes, because a lot of those places use diesel to create electricity, which then
Yeah.
they use to heat. And if they could
Miss that step
miss
and
that
just go
step in the
direct?
middle where they just go direct to heat their houses using geothermal, even if they get water out that's not even hot. You drill a well and then you have 10 or 20 degree water. If you're heating your house to 10 or 20 degrees from -40, then you could
Mhm.
use like a space heater to heat your house to like a comfortable temperature. You would be
Yeah,
saving a considerable amount of power. So yeah,
that's
I
really
think
cool.
that's what I'm excited about for the future of geothermal. And I
That's a
think it's
fantastic.
finally like gaining traction because I think there are quite a few projects that are hopefully coming online in the next 5 to 10 years.
I
Yeah.
think what I didn't know that you just told me, and I just learned right now, is that what's really cool about this geothermal system is it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think that's so different than most technology or most renewable energy that you think, okay, it has to have perfect output and it has to be able to produce electricity. But then what you're saying is no, you can still use it. You can just use it for heat, for either thermodynamic, like heat, or bring you halfway there within a space heater. I love that you can use it in tandem and it can get you maybe 30, 50, 100% there, but you can still use it. I think that just blows open the doors of use cases that you could do with geothermal.
So for the power plants, those cases they have to be more perfect because you're putting energy into the grid. You have to
Mhm.
sell it to an end user or whatever, energy policy, etc. But I think where geothermal is going to really come in is heating those remote communities, which is what we're trying to do in Nunavut, actually. So we're going up to Resolute Bay. I went last year, actually, it's for just for a week, just to
Mhm.
do a little bit of a reconnaissance survey to collect a few data points to plan out our big survey that we're doing this summer. But we have two projects in Cambridge Bay and Resolute Bay, two communities that are, they have to basically boat in diesel once a year
Wow.
to heat and
Yeah.
power their communities
For the entire year too,
for the
probably,
entire
right?
year.
That's
So they
hard.
have an entire year's worth of supply.
Whoa.
And we're hoping that so Resolute Bay is on a little sedimentary basin, which is actually reasonably warm. So we're hoping that if we can get, I don't know, 20 or 30-degree
Yeah.
waters, we would be able to heat those houses and increase their quality of life. Because I
Yeah.
think a lot of them have issues heating their homes, especially with this. You can imagine how expensive that is.
It should just be a right that your home is warm, especially in a place like Canada and in a place
Yeah.
like Nunavut where it's freezing out for like health and safety. You need to be able to have a warm house. So the fact that you could come into that community and do so much good just with geothermal and just using that natural gradient, that's fantastic. One thing that you mentioned there with your upcoming Nunavut work is that you did a quick reconnaissance survey and now you're doing a big survey. Your research is really heavily field based. Could you explain what and how a field season works, what it entails? What is a survey? When you talk about we're doing a survey, what does that actually look like? And then what are you responsible for when you're out there collecting data?
So we're in a weird situation as being, I think, usually if you're in a commercial industry, there's only one geophysicist on your team and you're collecting data. Versus when we're going to Nunavut this year, it's going to be like the entire team is geophysicists,
Oh, wow.
which is an interesting thing. So then we all end up being just on an equal playing field. If you're in a commercial survey, you'd be setting up a lot of stations and then just moving them along versus when you're in academia, we do a lot of planning for the surveys and then we set them up and we do some testing and it's a bit more laid back, but then we are also taking a lot more time to do QC on all of
Yeah.
our data acquisition. Okay, so basically a survey, we're gonna ship all our equipment up to Resolute Bay and then we're gonna show up and our equipment's gonna be there and we're gonna charge some batteries and all that kind of stuff. And then we'll get up the next day and we'll go out and we have 3 magnetometers per station, a reel of wire, and then 4 electrodes. We're going to show up to our station. We have our central unit where we have to hook everything into. There's going to be one person who's wiring everything up.
Okay.
And then there's
That's
going to be one
connecting
person
everything together.
who's walking out like 100 meters north and then dig a little hole, put an electrode in it, and then wire that up to the central unit. And then they're going to go out east. So you have basically 3 electrodes in the middle, and then 1 electrode north, 1 electrode east or west. And then we'll be putting these magnetometers out as well. So there'll be a third person usually, sometimes a fourth, sometimes there's two people putting magnetometers out because those
Okay.
take actually a lot of digging. And so then you have to dig a little trench to put your magnetometer in, and that also has to be oriented north-south.
Correctly. For those at home, what is a magnetometer? What does it look like?
The one we're using in the field, it is a giant tube about the width of a can. And then it's like 3 feet tall.
Oh, wow. It's big.
So
Yeah.
it's pretty big. And then the inside of it is literally just a big turn of wire.
Cool.
It's just a giant solenoid, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like a
All it
million
is
turns of
coil.
wire, just all.
And then to get to that location, are you carrying all of those equipment? Are you mostly helicopter work? How does that look?
It's a lot of we almost always drive, either that or helicopters.
Very
So,
cool.
because you're not carrying this equipment very far.
How long do you leave it? Are you out in the field, living in the field for the entirety of the season? What is the length of time that you usually leave your equipment?
So the equipment, so back to survey. So we install this thing and we're going to bring 3 of them. So
Mm.
usually one is always running. Just like sometimes it's nice to have a backup. We want to install 3 stations and then usually we just move 2 of them is what we do in a day. We'll get up, we'll unearth one station, collect the data, move it to a different place, and then install it again. And then basically we'll be there for about 2 weeks, just moving
Wow.
2 stations a day. We're not even going very far for the survey because we want it to be around the town.
Okay.
So we'll be just like around town, a little ways over.
Oh, that's very
The
nice.
survey's going to be pretty dense and we're just going to be around. The locals
Okay.
will be like, "Oh, it's those guys again." Just wandering
100%.
around,
Yeah, they're gonna
digging up
come
this
up to you.
moving
Yeah.
these little things. Everyone knows we're gonna be there because the town is like 200 people or something. So interestingly, some of the fieldwork is pretty urban. So in the Yukon, when we were there, we were actually at Watson Lake because geothermal is useless if it's not like right next to a town. You
It
can't
has to
really
be fairly
transport. We're just like
PowerPoint.
hanging out in town, dressing around.
That's so
What
funny.
the heck are these guys doing?
Do people come and, like, talk to
Yes.
you?
Oh yeah.
Oh, I'm sure,
Oh
like,
yeah.
anyone who's over the age of 80 is probably in there like a dirty sheet that's just like, "What are you guys doing?"
Yeah. Oh yeah,
I
for sure. And especially like in smaller communities, they're like, what the heck?
Oh, I love
No one
that.
ever goes down this road. Like,
You're like, "We do, and we're gonna be here for 2 weeks and just moving around this tube."
usually when we drive to these locations, we have a truck that's like University of Alberta on the side, and that definitely helps. Most of the time, people just come up because sometimes like, you see a random truck driving on the road, and you're like, "Oh, what the heck? What are they
Mhm.
doing here?" And then you see it's like, "Oh, there's like a University of Alberta truck in the Yukon," and that's just
Another
begging for
thing.
someone to come and ask me.
Yes, 100%. You're begging for attention, questions, and probably a couple, like, witty remarks, like, a couple
Yeah.
insults headed your
Well,
way.
yeah. I think you missed the turn or
Yeah.
something, and you're like, okay.
Some cheeseball remark that you're like, "Oh god, I wish I was back at Mount Meager. I wish no one was talking
It's
to
only
me
a
up
couple
here."
marmots, you know?
Yeah, that's it, up in the middle of the mountain. Well, very, very cool. I think the, like, field work aspect is so different. So thank you so much for talking about, like, your research and how it works and how a field season works. We're gonna switch topics completely because 'cause we're now gonna go into something totally different, but you do so much. I actually don't know how you do this much, but you do a lot. And you're an active part of the community with EDI at the University of Alberta, specifically within the physics department. And I read online that it's the Physicists for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusivity. That's the committee. Could you kind of walk through what the committee does? What work do you do? And what are some major kind of initiatives or changes that you're working on right now in the university?
It's a pretty just diverse group of people who want more diversity in physics. And the main thing that we're working on at the moment is what we call the climate survey.
Okay.
And basically, we don't collect any demographic information as a university or a department. So it's really difficult to implement policies to promote inclusion and diversity within the department, because physics is a very numbers-based discipline, as you can imagine. So when you're at a department meeting, you go, hey, I think we need to work on our office culture. They go, it says you, I guess.
So you want to come in with some numbers behind it
We
so you
want
can
to, we
speak
got
their
to say
language.
numbers.
Yeah.
So we did our second climate survey. So we're doing it every 2 years.
Okay.
And it's basically just a survey that's, getting some demographics. How many women do we have in the department? How many,
Probably
queer people do we
positions
have in the
too.
department?
Yeah.
Racialized groups, who identifies as a racialized group, stuff like that. And then as well as just, do I feel welcome in the department? Have I experienced any offhand comments from coworkers or professors about, things that make me uncomfortable? Was it directed at you or was it directed at someone else? That type of thing. To be able to actually have numbers of 20% of
Quantify it.
undergrads have
Yeah.
experienced some sort of discrimination due to their being a minority,
Yeah.
whether it's
Yeah.
gender or otherwise.
That's
And then if we
beautiful.
can see a trend over the years, if we can collect this data once every 2 years and to see if our initiatives are working, or if we can bring that data to the table and say, this, we have a problem.
It's a shame that they need that data. It is shameful that a department or a university is, yeah, show us proof that we don't believe you. Please come with numbers. It's a shame that they put you in that position, but it's so wonderful that you're doing that survey and doing that culture report, because it's important to have quantifiable numbers so you could actually work and use the same language, use what they use to be like, look, this is exactly what's happening within our department.
We're just hoping that we'll be able to maybe use that to be part of some other initiatives that we have on the campus.
Cool.
They have some programs for hiring women as lab assistants from high school in order to inspire them to get into physics, and some other programs like that. So we're hoping that this will be able to
Kickstart
help our
others.
lobbying power
Yeah, totally.
within the department. Otherwise, just providing an inclusive space where people can feel comfortable.
It's really wonderful that you could then join in with other initiatives and use that data set as a kickstart for bringing in other women as lab assistants, or to change the department, to change the demographics. Zoe, that's fantastic.
It kind of came to us so there's the American Physical Association, APA,
Okay.
I think. And they have a once every 2 months workshop on EDI. And a lot of it is American universities talking, or one of the only Canadian universities that go.
Wow.
And we were actually just amazed at the amount of information that they have on their students. And American schools, because they're trying to push these initiatives, they are collecting a lot of demographic information, which does help at least reflect on, because you do have that kind of bias, or at least I do, where you go into a room where there's 10% women. And because I'm so used to being the only woman in the room, I go,
1% woman.
This is
Yeah.
amazing.
I do that too. I'm like, there's 6 of us.
And then I actually do the numbers and I'm like, oh, there's 3 of us and there's 50 people in this room. Without some actual data to back it up, it does feel like it's better than it is.
That's a really good point, because I do think it is a university policy thing. I think in Canada, I don't think you can ask. I think it might be.
No, you can't.
I think it's illegal to ask. I think you can put in an optional area where people can self-disclose, but I think for most part you can't. But I think you bring up a really good point about bias that I didn't even consider, because I do the same thing. I'm guilty of it as well. If there's 2 of us in a room, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the most equitable place I've ever been in my life. This is fantastic. Where you're right, it's nice to have that data set and the true data to be like, no, we're still 2% or less than 1%, or the women that you're seeing are dropping off when we're terms of PhD or postdoc or professors, right? So you could also do a demographic and position argument. The data that y'all are collecting within the department, I think, is fantastic. And it's just a really cool initiative. And then, just because we're almost at the top of the hour, though, is what are you most excited for? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, so I'm writing a paper. So a bit late maybe because I'm in my 4th year of my PhD and I'm
Ah,
writing my
it's
first
okay.
paper. But I have a few that I need to actually just I've procrastinated on it so long that I'm like, "Oh, no, now I have 3 papers I need to publish." I really don't want to. Anyway, so I'm just making figures, and it's a good place to be in because I have a lot of really exciting stuff to share.
That's kind of part of the PhD. I could imagine. And when it is done, you let me know, and then we'll put it on this podcast. We'll tag it to your episode and
Okay,
we'll put in your
perfect.
paper so people can read them. Because I'm excited to hear what you're going to do. Not going to understand half of it or be able to pronounce it,
Well, these
but
are nice figures. So you
okay,
know what?
I could look at a figure. I would love to look at a figure. Absolutely. Thank you, Zoe, for coming on. It's been such a pleasure. It was lovely to talk about your research, field work, running around in your truck, and also your EDI and all the good that y'all are doing at the University of Alberta within the physics department. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an honor to have you on.
Fabulous. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for listening. This is the Smoko podcast. Please tune in next week and join us. We'll be back on Smoko.